Hello and welcome. In today's video, I'm going to talk about the composition API and how you can use it for building a global state management in a Vue.js application, and how you can save your global state in a local storage or in a cookie. So we're going to use a simple example, but this approach can be applicable for more complex scenarios. Our global state will consist of two modules. One will be a user data and another will be a list of movies. So when the user submits the form, data that come from the server will be stored in the user module. Any update to the user module will be saved in the local storage, so when a user refreshes the page, the user data on the screen will remain the same. In the movie module, we're going to have two types of movie. One will be like an open type and another will be the type that requires user to log in. Logged in users will be able to add or to remove a movie from the list. Now, when I click on the logout button, only the open type movies will be visible. That means that the state in the movies module will be reactive to changes in the user module. I will start by creating a project with vue-cli. Select the Vue 3 template and wait for the build. I will open the project with Visual Studio Code and make the screen bigger. I will run the app with npm run serve command, and it should be available in the browser. This is how our template looks like, and I will remove some parts of the component that are not needed. I will remove Hello World component and also styles from the app view component. And we can also remove Hello World file and delete it. So our template is clean now. I will create a new component, movie list, that will be in charge for displaying the list of movies. So inside the template, I will add another list with list item that I will use to iterate through the list of movies. And for the name, I will set movie list, and the setup function that I will use to return a default value for the movie list. So I will create an array of objects with property ID and title, and I will store it in the movies variable. Setup function will return an object with property movies that will be available inside our template. I will use v4 directive and iterate through the list of movies, and it's important to set a key property, which will be a movie ID. And inside the list item, I will display a movie title. So let's include this movie list into the app component and see how it looks in the browser. Movies are displayed, but what happens if we need to have access to movie list outside of the movie list component? Let's say that we want to have number of movies in the app component. In order to make this state globally available, I will create a store with some modules. So first module will be use movie state. So first I'm going to create a default state variable where I will store array of movies. And I will create a state variable which will be a reactive variable. So I will use reactive function from Vue.js. And that will allow components to track changes in the state and to react accordingly. I will also create a getters variable, which will be an empty object, and actions that will also be an empty object. So this module will export the function that will return an object with a state property, which will return read-only state. And this is important because we don't want to allow anyone to change values or to reassign our state. And we are going to expand our getters and actions with spread operator, so all the methods inside will be available in every component. I will import use movie state in the movie list component. And inside the setup function, I will call use movie state, and I will be able to access the global movie state. So instead of returning the value of the local state of this component, the setup function will return the global state. Movie list is still correctly displayed, and we can use a movie state name for the state of this module. Because if we have many different modules, a generic name for state can be confusing. Now let's see what we can do in the app view component regarding the number of movies. I will import use movie state and create the same setup function as in the movie list component. So I will be able to access movie list in the app view component. And I can create a property name number of movies, which will be the length of the movies from the list. Now this data is available in the template, and here is a number of movies. So imagine that we should use this movies.length on many other components. It would be much better if we created a getter method inside the getters object. We can call this method getNumberOfMovies, and it will just return a computed value of the length of the movies array. With computed function, this getter method will be reactive to any change in the movies array. And everything works the same. I will create a new component, UserLogin, and in the template I will create a form element with some input fields. I will add a name property, UserLogin, and inside the form element I will add a label for the email field and also the input with a type email. And another input field, which will be a password, and an input with a type password. Let's also add a button element so the user can submit the form, and I will also add a type submit. Now let's create a setup function and put some data in order to create a two-way data binding between data and the input fields. I will create a reactive variable user form, and it will be an object with properties email and password, and both of them will be an empty string. And let's also import ref from Vue.js. And the setup function will return an object with the user form property. Now user form is available in the template, so we can use we-model directive in order to have two-way data binding between the input fields and the user form variable. So when a user changes the value of the input field, user form will be automatically updated. I will attach a submit event to the form with prevent modifier, and I will create onSubmit method inside the setup function. So for now, I will just console log the value of the user form, and I will add onSubmit to the object that is returned from the setup function. And let's include the UserLogin component into the app component. And let's check in the browser. So now we have the user login form. And if we type something in the email field and the password field, and when we submit the form, we should have the user form value in the browser's console. Now, instead of doing console log, I would like to make a fake API call and store the response from the server into the global state. I will create an async function login, which will return a promise. And inside the promise, I will call setTimeout, which will resolve the promise after 3000 milliseconds. And inside the resolve, I will add an object with first name and the last name of the user. So this will be our fake API call that will return some data after 3000 milliseconds. Now let's import login into the user login component. And instead of console log, I will just call login function, and I will provide then callback, which will have data as an argument, and I will just console log that data. So let's type something into our input fields, and after pressing submit, after 3 seconds we have first name and last name in our console. So I would like to store this data into our global state, and I will create a new module, use user state. First, I will create default state variable with user data property, and inside I will add first name, which will be an empty string, and the last name, which will be also empty string. And I will create a reactive variable from default state, and also import reactive from Vue module. And I will create getters object that will contain getter methods, and actions object that will contain actions. And a default export will be a function that will return an object with property state, which will return read-only of state variable, and also getters and actions. Now I will create an action that we are going to call after the response from the fake API call. I will call it update user data, and it will have an argument which will be an object with properties first name and last name. And inside the method, I will update the value of the state with values from the arguments. Now I will import use-user-state into UserLogin component. And I will call it in the setup function. And I will destruct the object and access update user data action. Now we can call this action inside the then callback, and we can pass data as an argument. We can also include the state in the template in order to make sure that the changes are correct. Now, when we submit the form, after 3 seconds, we should be able to see changes in the global user state. It works fine. First name and last name are populated, so we can remove the state from the template. Now I will create a new component where I want to use user data from the global state, and I will call it UserProfile. I will create a div element with the h3 element inside, and I would like to display full name of the user. I will add a name property to this component and also a setup function. Inside the use user state, I will create a new getter, get full name, which will return a computed value from the user data's first name and the last name. And it's very important to use computed here because it will make this getter reactive to changes inside the user state. I'm using string interpolation here, and now we can access this get full name inside the user profile component. So inside this component, I will import use user state module, and I will call the default function. And inside the object, I will access this getter, and the setup function will return the property full name, which we'll call get full name getter. Now we can use full name inside the template. I will import user profile component into the app component. And I will also register it. Okay, we forgot to import computed in our use user state module. So now it should work. And if we enter some values in the email and passwords input fields and click submit, we should get the full name displayed on the screen. But user is not always logged in, so it doesn't make sense to display user profile every time. So I'm going to create a new state is logged in, which will tell us if the user is logged in or not. We can create a new action, update is logged in, and it will have a new logged in status parameter, and it will update the value of the is logged in state. So we can call this action from within update user data action. So that means that it will set the is logged in status to true every time when we call update user data. Now we can include use user state module into the app component and check if the user is logged in. And we have access to the global user state, and we can use it under user state name. And now we can set a property is logged in to user state dot is logged in. And if the user is logged in, we are going to display user profile component. Let's check how it works in the browser. If we type something in the input fields and press submit, we should be able to see user profile component, but for some reason it doesn't work. So what do you think? What is the reason for this behavior? If you check the app component in the setup function, there is a return property is logged in, and here we access the property of the user state is logged in, and at that point we lose reactivity in our template. We use just the initial value and our template doesn't react to changes in the global state. So in order to fix this, we can use the whole state in our template, like user state.isLoggedIn, or we can create a getter. Computed function will make this getter reactive. Now we can use this getter in the app component, and I will call it in the returning object of the setup function. Now when we enter some data into the input fields, after submitting the form, we should get the user profile component with the full name of the user. As I mentioned, another approach would be to return the whole user state in the setup function, and that way our template will be reactive to changes in the user state. And if you check it in the browser, it should work the same. Now I would like to add a new property to our global user state, and that will be a loading, and it will have a default value of false, and it should indicate when the app is in the process of fetching user data from the server. We can also create an action method that will update the value of this state property. So it will have a loading status as a parameter, and it will update the loading property of the state. Now we can use update loading action in the user login component, and I will call it before the login function, and I will set it to true. And in the finally callback, I will also use update loading action, but I will set the loading status to false. Now I would like to use loading state in the UserLogin component, and I will include the whole user state and return it from the setup function, so it will be available in the template. When the loading is true, I would like to disable the submit button, and we can also change the text. So text loading should be displayed when the loading is true, otherwise it should be submit. Now when we submit the form, button should be disabled until we get a response from the server. Inside the app component, we can hide the form when the user is logged in. And we can also change directive to else for user profile, and it should work fine. Now let's add some new features to the movie list component. First, I will wrap the template with a div element, and I will add a button that will be used for adding a new movie to the list. I will add an event directive and call on add movie click method that will be created in the setup function. And let's create an action that will be called inside this method. The name of the action will be add movie, and it will have a new movie as a parameter that will be pushed to the existing list of movies. Now let's include this action in the movie list component. And let's call it inside on add movie click method. The argument will be an object with property ID, which will be generated by the amount of movies. And I will import get number of movies getter. So the ID will be equal to get number of movies value, the value because it is a computed property, plus 1. And the title will be the same, just with a movie text in front of the ID. We should include on add movie click method in the returned object of the setup function. And now the user is allowed to add new movies to the list. But that's too much power, so I would like to limit that. I want to allow adding new movies only to logged in users, so I will need to import use user state in order to check if the user is logged in. I will use get is logged in getter, and I will set the property in the returned object of the setup function. And now I can do a conditional rendering of the add movie button. Now when the user is not logged in, the button is not visible, and when we submit the form and the user is logged in, button should be visible again. Now let's add a new button which will be used for removing the movie, and I will add it into the list item element, and it will have X letter and a click event directive which will call remove movie action with the movie ID as an argument. Let's create this action in the use movie state module. So remove movie will have movie ID as a parameter. And first we are going to find the index of the movie that we are going to remove. I will access the movies state and call find index method, which will have a callback function that will return the index of the movie that has this movie ID from the parameter. Now with the index of the movie that we are going to remove, we can use the splice method that will remove this movie item from the array. You can also use a filter method, which will be more efficient in this case. Let's include remove movie action into the movie list component, and we should return it in the setup function, so it will be available in our template. And let's check in the browser how it works. I will refresh the screen, and when I press the remove button, it should remove the movie and also update the number of movies. This button should be available only for logged in users, so I will add we-if directive for conditional rendering. We can check in the browser if it works properly. So buttons should be visible only if the user is logged in. We can also add a logout button, and we can do it inside the user profile component. So I will create a button in the template with onClick directive, which will call, let's check the name of the action. It will call update is logged in, and it will set the value to false. And let's include it in the setup function, and we can check in the browser how it works. When the user submits the form and gets response from the server, the logout button should be available. We can add a couple of movies, and when we press logout button, the login form should be visible again. Now let's make things more complicated, and let's say that we want to have some movies that will not be displayed if the user is not logged in. So movies that have requires login property set to true will not be displayed for the users that are not logged in. And movies that have requires login set to false will be displayed for both logged in and not logged in users. Let's also update add movie action with requires login property, and it will be always false. Let's make a new getter in the use movie state, which will return a different array of movies depending on whether the user is logged in or not. It should return a computed function that will make this getter reactive to changes inside the movies and the user global state. We'll need to import use user state inside the use movie state in order to check if the user is logged in or not. I will call it inside the get movies. And use get is logged in getter in order to check the value of is logged in state. I will call get is logged in inside the if statement and get the value of this getter because it is a computed property. And if the value is true, we should return all movies from the global state. Otherwise, we should return only the movies that have requires login property set to false. And I will use the filter method for that. Let's go back to the movie list component. So I will include this getter from the use movie state, and I will call get movies getter inside the returned object of the setup function. Now user who is not logged in will see only movie 1 and movie 3, and when the user is logged in, we should see all 3 movies. We can also make sure that adding and removing movies are still working. But with this template, it's hard to know which movie requires a login and which not. So I will update the template of the movie list component with that information. I will add login required next to the movie title, and it should be displayed only if the property requires login is set to true. Now it's much easier to see that the movie 2 is the movie that requires user to be logged in. Now let's say that we want to save user state to the local storage, so the state won't be changed after refreshing the page. Before returning the object in the default function, we can set a local storage key with the value of the user state. I will use setItem method from the local storage, and the key will be user state. The value must be string, so I will stringify user state. Before setting this local storage key, we should check if it already exists. I will use getItem, and if the value is equal to null, we should create a local storage key with the value of the state. We can also create a constant variable for the local storage key because it's easier when we reuse it on different places. Now we can replace the string with the variable, and now we can read the default value from the local storage, and I will create a function that will return a default value. So it will check if the key exists in the local storage. And if it does exist, we should convert local storage value from string to JavaScript object. So I will use JSON parse for that. And in case that there isn't a user state value in the local storage, we should just return the default object. Now, instead of using the default state object for the state variable, I will use getDefaultState function. And if you check the local storage value in the browser, it is in the application tab, you will see the user state key. So what happens if we enter some data and submit the form? The user is logged in, but the value in the local storage is not updated. So in order to achieve reactivity in the local storage, we can use watch function from Vue.js, and it will watch for changes in the user global state and update the local storage value accordingly. So inside the watch callback function, we should set a new value for the local storage key. And that value must be string, of course. And the third parameter will be options. And it's important to set deep property to true because we have nested object structure. So now if we type something in the user login form and press submit, the local storage value should be updated. So even if we refresh the page, components will display data from the local storage. But we have a small bug. If we press logout button, the user data will not be reset. So we can make some changes in the update is logged in action. So if the is logged in parameter is equal to false, we should reset the first name and the last name of the user data to an empty string. And now if we check in the browser, when we press logout button, first name and the last name should be empty. Thank you for watching this video. If you have some thoughts about state management in Vue.js, please leave comments below. And if you find this video useful, please share it and subscribe to my channel.